Hello and welcome to The Last Word. How significant is the Supreme Court's order that Lal Batti usage must be sharply curtailed, and will this end the culture of perks and privileges we shower on important people? That's with the Supreme Court lawyer who was the amicus curiae in this case, Harish Salve, former Delhi Chief Secretary Shailaja Chandra, BJD Lok Sabha leader Jai Panda, and the well-known author Shobha De. Let's start with Lal Battis before we come to the wider Lal Batti culture. Shobha De, would you accept that the Supreme Court direction to the central and state governments that they must by the middle of July sharply curtail the use of Lal Battis, otherwise the court itself will step in and do that work for them, is in fact a landmark decision in a country like India?
Oh, completely, Karan. There's no doubt about that. It's a very enlightened decision, I have to say. But I don't know that it's going to solve the problem, because the Lal Battis, in fact, are not just on top of the cars of these overinflated egos and the netas who, and others, of course, who misuse the Battis. But the Lal Batti is inside their mind and head. It's a post-colonial hang-up that we have, that we need these definitions to display to the world just how important we are. For all of this to work, we have to first make up our minds who qualifies as a VIP, who is a VVIP. Is the nephew of a minister entitled to a Lal Batti? The misuse of the Lal Batti is even scarier than the Lal Batti itself. But yes, I'm completely with this entire, the spirit of this is completely the right thing to be doing in a democracy. No other democracy in the world has such a display of blatant power and pomp and circumstance. For what? And tax-paying citizens are often at a huge disadvantage. They're discriminated against.
Okay.
And the Lal Batti is creating hierarchies and discrimination. It's saying we are somehow more important than you are. We are entitled to privileges that the rest of you are not. And the Lal Batti culture and that syndrome simply has to go.
Jai Panda, you're very much the sort of politician, I imagine, that Shobha De had in mind when she says that the really worrying Lal Batti culture is the one inside the heads of politicians. Do you plead guilty to the syndrome and mindset that she believes politicians as a whole share, that they like to see themselves as special and privileged and a cut above the ordinary Aam Aadmi?
Karan, I'm sorry to disappoint you. I have in fact written articles in major national newspapers asking for precisely the kind of decision that the Supreme Court has taken, not just for Lal Battis. For instance, I have also demanded that exemption from airport security must be limited just to 5 constitutional heads: the President, the Vice President, the Speaker, the Prime Minister and the Chief Justice, and no one else. And let me point out, I think Shobha De is right though. I think unfortunately a large part of my fraternity probably do have a hangover, and not just politicians, even middling government officials, bureaucrats, enjoy Lal Batti culture. And this is very much a third world mentality, that if you cannot provide basic amenities to all the citizens, at least you secure some for yourself if you're in the ruling class. And that has to change. Fortunately, some states and some places in the country are ahead of the curve. In my state, for instance, in Odisha, MPs and MLAs do not routinely enjoy Lal Batti protection. Only 4 or 5 MLAs under specific threat from Naxalites and others have such protection and facilities. So I welcome this wholeheartedly.
Shailaja Chandra, the truth is that the Times of India has revealed that already 27 categories of public functionaries are permitted to use Lal Battis, and the authorities are now seeking to add to the list deputy commissioners and subdivisional magistrates. So in these circumstances, do you believe that central and state governments will actually accept the Supreme Court's suggestion, or will they defy it?
Well, since I've dealt with this subject, maybe I could tell you the correct position as given in the Motor Vehicles Act. You see, there is the central motor vehicles rules and the state's motor vehicle rules. The states are empowered to list the people who can be given this flashing red light, you might say, protection. Not protection, I mean it is on their bonnet. Or it could be without flashing red light.
Quite right.
That is specified. But what has happened is that the subdivisional magistrates and the deputy commissioners have been recently, in February 25th, been given this authority to have non-flashing lights. That is to enable them when there is an emergency. It has been specified only when they have an emergency, otherwise the lights are to be hooded.
But can I interrupt?
Let me just
can I
add.
interrupt? You're going into details which might actually confuse the audience. It's a simple issue. It's the fact that battis, whether red, blue or amber, are used to identify people as special and privileged and separate from Aam Aadmi. And do you think that mindset will change because of the Supreme Court's suggestion, or will central and state governments defy it? Give me an answer to that.
I don't think central and state governments will change what they're doing, because that is the only way that you can distinguish a cabinet minister, a speaker. What has happened is that a large number of statutory authorities have abrogated this authority to use a red light in the name of equivalence. There is in that rule a word equivalence. So all kinds of people have abrogated the right, and the police say we have better things to do. If we stop anyone or fine anyone, our bosses will simply stop us and say, don't you have better things to do?
I'm going to stop you there. I'm going to stop you there, Shailaja Chandra, because actually you're attempting to explain why this abuse of the Lal Batti system happens. And the irony is that it happens in the name of equivalence, yet equivalence is the one thing it doesn't establish. Shobha De, you were probably very right a moment ago when you said that despite the Supreme Court's landmark decision, it's not going to have any impact on the ground and governments will do precisely what they want. Are you dismayed by what you've heard from Shailaja Chandra, despite the fact that the only politician with us, BJ Panda, actually supports you?
No, I was so very delighted, and I want to congratulate him for saying what he did on television tonight. It's very rare to get that kind of plain speak from a politician, and he's someone I respect, so I'm glad that he upheld what the Supreme Court decision actually implies. But I can see this decision being fought tooth and nail across the board, because privileges are not that easy to give up, and these guys are not going to abandon them in a hurry unless they're compelled to do so. Unfortunately, that's how it goes, because the Lal Battis are to netas what chamchas are to Bollywood stars. It defines their position in society. Without those Lal Battis, they believe, and they probably are, really nothing at all. Most of them also misuse the Lal Batti. Their relatives misuse the Lal Batti. Their secretaries, their hirelings, their juniors misuse it, causing tremendous inconvenience to just the Aam Aadmi, for whom there is complete disregard. Traffic mismanagement, all of that. You see these guys whizzing past in their cavalcades with those Lal Battis, and most right-thinking Indians say, what a nuisance.
Absolutely.
And it's about time this whole practice was abandoned.
Let me bring in at this point Harish Salve, who joins us. He was in fact the amicus curiae on this case. At the moment, we are coming to a point where Shobha De is arguing that unless the Supreme Court can find ways of enforcing its suggestion, it will find that the 2.5 or 3.5 months it's given central and state governments will simply be ignored. Now, before you answer, I want to point something else out. Judges themselves, and I'm talking specifically about the Allahabad High Court and the Andhra Pradesh High Court, have also insisted that governments give Lal Battis to their fellow brethren. And when in fact the Allahabad UP government contested the Allahabad High Court ruling in the Supreme Court dismissed it on the grounds that it was such a small thing. So then today, when the Supreme Court has actually revised its own position, will it also now add teeth and enforce it, or will it allow governments to defy its suggestion, as has happened in the police reforms case?
Let me tell you, Karan, I have raised a constitutional issue, which I think is far deeper and far more pervasive. Are we a republic or are we not a republic? If we are a republic, and the principle of equality and egalitarianism, which are constitutional principles, these are not policies, if they are enforceable as they are, then how can you create classes? Today you can have symbols which are the majesty of our constitution. So that is why the court has said the President of India, the Prime Minister of India, the Chief Justice of India, the Chief Justice of a High Court, the Governor of a state, the Chief Minister, these are the heads of the constitutional wing of government, the constitutional pillars of governance.
Okay.
You want to symbolize the majesty of the Constitution, you give them an insignia. Other than that, there is no scope for an insignia. And the court has very clearly indicated that this is the prima facie indication. You do it, otherwise we will decide this question of law.
In other words,
And if they decide the question of law as I am advocating, then they will strike down and issue a writ of mandamus preventing everybody from using it.
in which case, let me ask Jai Panda, speaking on behalf of your party, the BJD, whose Lok Sabha leader you are, do you believe that the Supreme Court's suggestion will be honoured both in spirit and in the letter without the Supreme Court 3.5 months later having to step in and actually change the law itself? I'm talking about Odisha specifically.
Well, as I told you earlier, Odisha already in fact abides by most of what the Supreme Court has ordered today, but we need to carry the rest of the country along with us. Fortunately, the Supreme Court's writ does run in our country, and in other cases the Supreme Court has had to step in and do the work that we should have been doing in Parliament or
not in the case of police reforms.
The executive.
The Prakash Singh police reforms have been ignored for over 5 years blithely by every government, central and state.
I agree with you. But I think the Supreme Court certainly has the power to follow up on this order, and as Harish Salve was saying, rule on the issue, on the point of law that he has raised, that are we all equal before the eyes of the law, or are there special categories of people besides constitutional heads?
Okay.
I hope it won't come to that, but I just want to make a quick point. I think really equally important as the Supreme Court's judgment in the eyes of politicians is the court of public opinion. And I think that is beginning to turn, the tide is beginning to turn. I'm hoping that it'll become a crescendo which we can't afford to ignore anymore.
All
but
right.
I think that's going to still take some time.
Let's take a break and let's say amen to that thought that politicians will bow to public opinion in India. That would be an interesting first if it happens. Let's come back and widen our discussion and talk not about Lal Batti specifically, but what we call the Lal Batti culture. The system of privileges, perks, priority and preferential treatment that we confer or that important people grab for themselves. Has the time come for all of that to be given up as well? That's in a moment's time. See you after the break. Welcome back to the last word. We're discussing India's Lal Batti culture. Shobhati, let's come to what I call the wider Lal Batti culture, which is an assortment of unjustified perks and privileges ranging from government houses at one end to special treatment at airports at the other for a range of people such as civil servants, MPs, ministers and a whole assortment of high office holders. Has the time come for an egalitarian democratic society to not just prune but slash these?
You know, the point is it's becoming so embarrassing to watch assorted people particularly at airports or in any public space when they're throwing their weight around and they're marching past people who are actually paying their salaries, the taxpayers, in a way that says there's a natural sense of privilege there. And that has a lot to do, as Mr. Panda said earlier, with a feudalistic mindset. I don't think that's going to change in a hurry, no matter what the Supreme Court may want and what even the better right-thinking people of India might want. We still live in the Middle Ages as far as the Maa-Baap culture of netas and people who are born into privilege, the way they behave. For heaven's sake, we've gone back to Maharajas and royalty and titles and all of that in the 21st century. So what are we talking about? Everybody today who holds any position of any power or even at the lowest possible level in the districts thinks of himself or herself as Raja and Rani, and we treat them as that. So you can take away those Lal Battis from their cars, but like I said, you can't take away the Lal Battis from the tops of their heads because they're already there.
Jai Panda, let me put it like this.
The whole attitudinal shift we're talking about, I don't see it happening in just because of the Supreme Court decision, not at all.
Jai Panda, let me put it like this. It's not just obvious perks. Quite often it's the hidden perks. For example, in NDMC Delhi, where all our rulers and our top bureaucrats live, the lights tend not to fail. The water tends to run 24 hours and doesn't go into shortage. The roads are better, security is greater, and worst of all, many MPs and bureaucrats actually sublet their premises and make money. Now, is any of that defensible and acceptable in a democracy?
No, as I said earlier, it's not just a feudal mindset, it's a third world mindset that you sort of you give up on providing all these amenities to the average citizen, and thus you have to secure them for yourselves if you're the tiny elite that rules it. But let me point out, this used to be much worse 2 or 3 decades ago. You know, 3 decades ago, if you wanted a telephone, you had to be a politician in power or know someone who was.
Okay.
Today, that's not the case. And there are many other examples where that system is breaking down. Don't forget, we have 120 Lok Sabha seats today which are urban, and the urban population is the one that is, turning the tide on this, particularly the growing middle class.
Okay.
I'm not sure we are at a tipping point yet, but certainly it's having an impact. There is talk among politicians. The only thing I'm sad about is that it had to be the Supreme Court taking the first step.
Let me put it like this,
Also,
Harish
Karan,
Salve.
If I may interrupt, Karan, for a moment, the sense of entitlement that is so apparent across the board, that sense of entitlement without the accompanying duties or responsibilities, when will that change? Unless that changes, nothing is going to change.
In fact, let me put a point to that and put that to both Shailaja Chandra and Harish Salve. First, Harish Salve, we're talking about the sense of entitlement. Why do ministers and MPs automatically get government houses and sometimes 4-acre plots in Lutyens, Delhi? In Britain, for example, no minister gets a house with a job unless, by good fortune, some benefactor has actually willed a property specifically to that ministry for the minister. And barely 2 or 3 ministers in England qualify in that category. Yet in India, every single minister, every deputy minister, every minister of state, every MP automatically gets government accommodation. Why?
Well, speaking for myself, the logic in favor of that is that they are from all over India, whereas England is a small country, so they live in one city, and therefore they must have accommodation. But if you ask me why must they have farmhouses in the middle of Lutyens, Delhi, there's absolutely no justification except saying that they are the proud successors of a feudal past. The rulers have changed, the system of ruling has not changed.
In other words, the colonial mentality continues.
That's the only answer. Absolutely, it is the colonial mentality. That's why we don't want to break the colonial houses. Speaking for myself, when they say this is the identity of Delhi, I don't see why we should have an identity of colonialism in this fashion. That if it is the identity of Delhi to have colonial houses, so that those who are ministers must live in colonial houses. I mean, I'm sorry, I think it's an anachronism.
And if it is the identity of Delhi, why should it be reserved only for politicians and bureaucrats and not the rest of the city? But Shailaja Chandra, let me put another example of that sense of entitlement that Shobhade spoke about to you. The Nehru Gandhis have lived in government accommodation without break since 1947. If the Supreme Court, as today's papers point out, can rule in the Bhutta Singh case, that security is not grounds for giving government accommodation, why does that logic not apply to the Nehru Gandhis, at least to Priyanka Gandhi, who's not even an MP and yet has a government house in Lodi estate?
Well, I would say hats off to the Supreme Court that they have said what they have said. I think now there should be a rethinking. People have taken this for granted in the name of security, and it is absolutely correct. Security and living in government houses are two separate things. It doesn't mean that because you're in a government house, you're better protected. That's the way the police would like to argue, because it's very comfortable to put up a tambu outside a Lutyens bungalow and not somewhere in the heart of Chandni Chowk. Certainly it won't work if you're in Kuchan, whatever it is, in the walled city.
Okay.
So nobody would like to say that a protectee should be anywhere but in Lutyens, Delhi, because the police will find it easier to look after the person. But that is a ridiculous argument. A person who is a politician should live in his constituency. I want to give you an example.
Very quickly, because we're out of time. Very quickly.
Yes, I agree. The government said that after retirement, if an officer opts for 3 times his salary as the head of a commission or something, but goes and stays in his own house or some hired accommodation, 3 times his salary, mind you, I mean, he could get the job. Most government officers refuse, because that house signifies a kind of a prestige and a power and a kind of elitism
Absolutely.
which does not exist outside.
And that is precisely the point Shobha De was making when she said that the really worrying Lal Batti is
Yes.
the one that people wear inside themselves. It determines their outlook
That's
and
the
their
bigger-
character.
that's the bigger
and
issue.
the sad part is that we as a society must accept that when people are deemed to be important, we somehow accept that they should treat themselves differently and be given special favors. Because we as a society accept it, they get away with it. That's something that we should all think about. But we've run out of time for tonight. My thanks to all four of my guests for joining me for what was both an entertaining and a very eye-opening show. Have a wonderful weekend. See you next week. Goodbye. Good night.